Another one. This has to do with the big issue that I've spent a good part of my life worrying about is, when does pragmatics constrain figurative language interpretation? So there's some people, and I would be included in this, say it comes in really early. It's right there from the beginning, given context, given the kinds of things that you may mutually understand with other people. Some people say it comes in late, so there are various kinds of default interpretations, either at the word level or the sentence or utterance level come in first, always, automatically. Some say, well, it depends on one aspect of pragmatics, so some aspects of pragmatics comes in early and other aspects of pragmatics comes in later. And so if you look at the literature here, and I'm being very general, you get lots of different data supporting lots of different positions. And the question is, which one is right? How do we know? Well, the concern here I have is that, again, the data that you get, the theory that you end up proposing or advocating really depends on a complex set of factors that actually interact with one another. And so the ones I want to tell you about, which I think are important and which have been empirically studied to some degree, have to do with the nature of people, the language particularly that's being studied, the goal and the task, as well as the methods that we use to assess people's pragmatic performance. Whoops, so people. Here are some of the things by which people differ. Their sex, their age, their occupation, their IQ, a whole variety of things having to do with their cognitive structures, including things, for example, like their working memory span or their short-term memory span. People who have shorter spans behave differently in experiments than people who have larger spans. Their education, their social status, the language they're speaking, their culture or cultures, their geographic origin, their religion, their political beliefs, their ethnicity, their personality, their expertise, their present and past kinds of bodily experiences, physiological differences such as disease, brain disorders, injuries, and their emotional states. It is impossible to have a study or a theory that says, this is how people ordinarily work, because it all depends on what aspect of people and who those people are that you're studying. And lots of studies have shown that these things all matter, and then these things all interact with one another that leads to a very complex situation. At the same time, this whole variable of people interacts with these other big variables, like the language materials. So language materials differ in terms of the particular language you speak and various aspects of the grammatical structure of the utterances that you're looking at, how conventional and novel they are makes a difference in processing and production, how frequent they are, how familiar they are to people, their prototypicality or their salience, their relations to embodied experiences, there's differences in genre, and there's whole other various kinds of form-meaning relations that differ. So these things all matter in terms of the results you get. And I'll take one example. So in my field work in metaphor, all of these factors matter in terms of what kinds of data you get and how good people are interpreting metaphors. So how do you kind of generalize to this is the theory of metaphor when all of these things matter? It all depends. Oops. There are different kinds of pragmatic goals and tasks. For example, in the case of understanding, we could ask about understanding in terms of the kinds of quick comprehension processes that people use in kind of ordinary conversation and kind of casual reading, such as the things you do when you read a newspaper. And then there's kind of slower, more reflective, sometimes conscious interpretations that one has as a goal when reading literature or poetry. Different kinds of pragmatic goals, such as solving problems and makes of decisions, have an influence upon interpretation, as does whether or not you're interpreting something for the point of thinking about arguments or making an argument in return or trying to persuade somebody. If you're trying to remember something that you're understanding, that's a kind of a different pragmatic goal. And if, for example, you're making various kinds of aesthetic judgments about what it is you're understanding, all of that has an influence upon what you're doing. And so when you're thinking about what language understanding is, the issue then is it all depends on what aspect you're looking at. Finally, in the field of experimental psycholinguistics, there's lots of different kinds of methods that we can use to assess people's pragmatic performance. And again, here is just some methods that we use for looking at language processing or interpretations. So we have reading time methods, paraphrase judgments, eye movements. We have various kinds of priming studies. A big one these days is the rise of cognitive neuroscience. So we have all sorts of brain scanning and brain activity measures that seem to be very interesting to people. We could ask people to give their open-ended interpretations of expressions or discourse. We could look at their ratings of aptness for things. There's these tasks where people have to match a sentence to a picture and whether or not they're similar or not. We can ask people to summarize a discourse or a narrative. We could look at people's memory for these things. We've had people draw pictures about what they've understood. We've had them understand and look at solve problems from that. There are all of these different kinds of methods. And again, the data you get depends upon which of these methods you use. It isn't as if a finding that you're interested in necessarily is found with each one of these kinds of methods. So it all depends. And so what this leads me to is what I consider to be a depressing to some conclusion. And this is just a gut feeling in my part, but I thought I'd share it with you. And that is, we will never be able to experimentally answer some of the big questions about pragmatics, as well as some of the big questions we have about other aspects of language and cognition. And the problem here is that, for the most part, when we do experiments, we are looking at average data, where we just simply get these means and we forget about the variability, and we're trying to come up with these theoretical models based on these averages. And one of the tendencies that you see that defines the field of experimental cognitive psychology is this strategy, which is what I call, what other people call, the effects equal structure fallacy. So this is what happens. You do an experiment on some aspect of, say, pragmatics that you're interested in. You get an effect. And then what do? You take that effect and you put it inside the person's head. There's got to be some mechanism, some little hunk of knowledge that is the causal basis for why you're getting this behavior. And the issue here that I want to suggest to you is that is simply a fallacy. It may be that we're getting complex behaviors out of people, not simply because of individuated kinds of things inside people's heads. And what we really need to do in being able to decide issues about egocentrism versus cooperation, whether or not the pragmatics comes in early or late, is that we need to have a more sensitive kind of set of tools and ways of thinking about stuff that includes the ability to look at all of these complex interactions between people, language, goals, tasks, and methods. And all of these things interact, which makes a very complex situation. So how do you deal with that? How can we possibly come up with a pragmatic theory for the entire world that encompasses all of these kinds of variabilities? And here's my solution, or rather the proposal that I want to make. What I want to suggest to you is an alternative view in terms of thinking about pragmatics in terms of processes of self-organization. And under this, I say that pragmatics arises from multiple interacting constraints that involve the interaction between brains, bodies, and world. So cognition is not something that's in your head. Cognition is something you do as a whole system, the interaction of your brain, the body, interacting with the world. Under this perspective, stability and variability, rather than being separate, independent things, are actually, as I say here, they're the different sides of the same coin, and they arise collectively through these processes of self-organization. Self-organization is a temporal and a spatial process of attraction and repulsion in which the internal organization of a system increases in complexity without being guided by an outside source. And I'm going to try to give you some illustrations of that. And the interesting thing here, I think, for some of the behaviors that we want to explain as pragmatists, is that a lot of self-organizing systems typically exhibit these emergent properties. And a lot of the things that we may be interested in describing pragmatically may, my argument is, be emergent properties of self-organizing systems rather than due to individuated mechanisms inside people's minds. Snowflakes. When I was a little kid, I was told that every snowflake is different. When I was a little kid, I was also told that God did that. He was up there, it was I don't know what he did, but he made each one of these things different. And I just remember these, oh, Jesus, he must be busy up there doing everything. But it turns out that snowflakes are actually self-organizing little systems. The fact that we have this tremendous variability is because of a variety of contextual, environmental things, and a few simple principles so that these different patterns here are all self-generated, from self-organizing processes. That's where they get their individuality. That's where they get their context specificities because of these self-organizing kinds of processes. Termites. I'm very happy that we're talking about termites finally in this conference. Termites are these little insects that are known to live in wood and eat houses. And so in California, we have to get your house inspected for termites. And if you have, I'm sorry, you have termites, you can't buy the house. It's horrible. But termites do some cool stuff that I think is relevant here. And it's relevant for demonstrating the process of self-organization, but it's also an analogy, I think, for how I'm trying to think about doing psychology. This is a termite nest. This is what they typically build. This is an example of one that's about 6 foot high. How do they do that? Here's another one that's about 8 foot high. This is a beautiful architectural structure. How do they do that? And here's the argument. Termites do not have little blueprints in their head where they get up and go, okay, let's go make this happen.